this course that normally I got in on week 2. We are now in week 10. So yes, this is the 10th week. Believe it or not, you've gone through 9 hours of this already. And if I had to guess how many more hours we had left, I would say 90. We really just started. We have so much more to go through, and it's exciting. And I will tell you this, though. This section, the signs, that's a very large part of this whole course. Okay? I have always been fascinated with studying the signs of his coming. And the reason for that is because Jesus has a discourse with his disciples. Okay? And we see that in Matthew, and we also hear it talked about in book of Luke. So those are the 2 books, the 2 Gospels that really talk about this discourse that Jesus is having with his disciples. And if you want to turn to Matthew chapter 24, that's fine. If you want to just listen, that's fine as well. Matthew 24, verse 1 says this: "And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." So what's the context of this? The context of this is, first, remember week 1. The 4 Gospels each have a specific theme within each Gospel. And this is extremely important anytime you're reading one of the 4 Gospels. Because if you look at the Gospels as to who they're written to, why they're written, and what they're trying to put across, then all of the things that you're reading will make a whole lot more sense. Okay? And there's confusion a lot of times in the book of Matthew, because Matthew is written to do what? Do you remember? What? It's written for the Jews. And to tell them what? Well, Jesus is the King of the Jews. He's the Messiah. He's the one they were waiting for. He's the one that the prophets talked about. He's the one that they talk about in Psalms, the suffering Messiah that David wrote about. Okay? And so when you read the book of Matthew, you have to keep that in mind. The book of Matthew, now you say, well, does that mean it doesn't apply to us? Well, of course it applies to us. Okay? But when it falls in relationship between the Jewish people and the church, something that we forget a lot of times, they are not the same thing. Yeah. The Jewish people are God's chosen people. You notice I didn't say were God's chosen people. The Jewish people are God's chosen people. God visited Abraham. He made promises to Abraham. And he visited, Isaac and Jacob, and there were promises made. And your seed and your generations, the Messiah will come from my people, which are your children, he told Abraham. Okay? And so, throughout prophecy, throughout the Old Testament, we look to the Jewish people to find the Messiah. Because that's where he was coming from. That's where he came from. Okay? But then something happens. Then the Jews reject their Messiah because he's not quite the Messiah they thought they were going to get. See, they wanted to forget about the suffering Messiah. And you have to understand why. They were living under an oppressive government, an oppressive Roman government, and they truly believed that the Messiah would come and kick the Romans out and set the Jewish nation free. They were looking for the conquering Messiah. They were looking for the king. And so when Christ came as the suffering Messiah first, see, the Jewish people forgot that the sacrifices were not the end all. When they performed sacrifice, that was not for forgiveness of sins. That was for the covering over of sins until the Messiah would pay the ultimate price and pay for sin. So it went from a tradition or a religion of covering over sin to a Messiah who was coming to tell his people, you don't have to do that anymore, because I'm paying the price that all those sacrifices pointed to, and they didn't see it. They didn't want to see it. And again, how often do we say, oh my goodness, those Jewish people, like that? How many times do we not see it? When Jesus is trying to teach us something. We have this, and we don't see it half the time. But they didn't have this. They didn't have the New Testament. They just had the Old Testament. And so you can't fault them as much as we do. Of course you can't fault them, because they should have been looking. But guess what? So should we.
Amen.
Because our Messiah is coming back.
Yeah.
Just like he promised.
Amen.
And so it went from a covering over of sin to a payment for sin. And it went from God's chosen people being the object of that or for that sacrifice to rejecting that, and then all of a sudden the church is born. And could the Jewish people have been part of that church? Absolutely. Every Jew that gets saved today is part of that church. It's what God intended for them in the first place. Okay? But we are told in the book of Daniel that 70 weeks are determined for his people. Okay? 70 weeks. 69 of which have already happened. And we've looked at those weeks, right? And now we have one more week left. And we're told, according to the book of Daniel, that we will know when that final week starts when he makes a covenant. Who's he? The Antichrist makes a covenant with the Jewish people. We would call that a treaty today. When Antichrist and the Jewish people sign a treaty that will allow them to begin sacrifice again. That's big. We just finished a discussion on pre, mid, and post-trib. You know when we're going to know who's right? If we watch that treaty being signed, I'm wrong. Because it's no longer pre-trib. If I'm alive and I see that treaty signed, then I know I'm wrong. And I'm going to start praying to be a mid-trib. Because I certainly don't want to be here through the whole thing. I don't even want to be here through the first half. You know my feelings. I think it's clear that it's pre-trib. I just don't even think there's just too much evidence. And if I didn't make that clear enough, please come to me and talk to me one-on-one. I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to yell. I'm not going to scream. Great men disagree. When I say men, I mean mankind. I'm not being a chauvinist. Okay? Great men and women disagree. All right? But in this situation, they go to the temple, and the disciples start bragging about how beautiful the buildings are. Look how wonderful this is, Lord. And Jesus says, I'm telling you, not one stone is going to stand on top of each other. Now, you have to understand that Jesus is talking to Jewish people. When Jesus was here in his earthly ministry, he preached and he taught to Jewish people. And you say, well, he also talked to the woman, the Samaritan woman. And what did he say? Should I give the meat to dogs? Now, as a Gentile, we might look at that and be a little bit offended. But the point that Jesus was trying to get across was not that Gentiles are dogs and he doesn't love them. He's trying to get this point across. I'm here for the Jews. I am a Jewish Messiah right now. Once he dies and raises from the dead, he becomes the Messiah for everyone. But guess what? Even after the resurrection, Jews were saying, well, if you want to be a Christian, then you have to take on the sacrifices, and you have to get circumcised, and you have to honor the feasts. Right? That's what they said. And Peter had a vision of what? A blanket coming down with all kinds of unclean animals. And Jesus says, eat it. And Peter says, it's unclean. He says, nothing is unclean anymore. Right. So back when he said, do we give meat to the dogs? Guess what? They're not dogs anymore. At that point, they were. Because that Samaritan woman was not performing sacrifice. She was not becoming a Jew. So salvation was not for her. She was as unsaved and far from God as you could possibly be. So in Jesus' eyes, she was a dog. She did not practice the Jewish religion, which still to that point was the only way to escape hell. You got to realize what's going on during all of this and what's the context. He wasn't calling Gentiles a dog. But at that point, if you were not a Jew, you were a dog. And so, her answer is amazing. Lord, even the dogs get crumbs that fall from the master's table. That's when she was saying, I believe you. I believe your teaching. I believe you're the Messiah. The Jews didn't even believe it. And he was here for them. This Samaritan woman, this dog, this non-Jew, this person that had no hope of heaven unless she became a Jew, was showing Jesus Christ, I can see it. And so Jesus in this passage is talking to his disciples and he's saying, listen, it might be beautiful now, but there's not going to be one stone left. And then the disciples come back to him later, because it says in verse 3, and he sat upon the Mount of Olives, and the disciples came unto him privately. So this was a conversation just between Jesus and his disciples. Okay? Tell us, when shall these things be? And they kind of do, I love this, because they kind of do what Daniel did. Remember when Daniel asked his question? Lord, how long are you going to deal with your, or how long are we going to be in captivity, and how long are you going to deal with your people? Okay, so not only was he asking about Babylon, but in God's eyes, Daniel's asking, how long are you going to deal with your people? And so we get Daniel's 70 weeks. And the disciples say, when will these things be? What are these things? When are these stones going to be taken down? So that not one stands on top of the other. Because that's what Jesus just got done telling them. So they're saying, Lord, when are these buildings going to be destroyed? And what shall be the sign of your coming? Boy, did they open up a can of worms. And they're going to get some answers that they weren't really asking, or didn't really understand that they were asking. And so Jesus goes into a discourse of not just the tribulation. And that's where the confusion stems many times when people look at end times. They look at the book of Matthew 24 and they assume that his whole answer is just about the sign of his coming. And it's not. It's about all of it, just like with Daniel. Jesus gives them an answer that only God could give, because he doesn't just see one thing. He sees it all. He sees the beginning, the middle, the end. And so that's the answer he gives them. And he tells them, you shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. Nation shall rise against nation. And if you combine Matthew and Luke, you get the whole conversation. Okay? Because remember, Matthew is trying to prove he's king of the Jews. What's Luke trying to prove? He's the perfect man. So you get more of the conversation when you read both books together. It's like a policeman going to a crime scene and interviewing more than one person. Why, if there's more than one example of a discourse, would you not want to read every witness's point of view? And what happens is you have people that read Matthew, okay, and then someone reads Luke, and instead of taking it like a policeman or a detective would, as two different witnesses showing two different sides of the same story, they say, oh, Luke contradicts Matthew, because Matthew doesn't say this, but it says it in Luke. That's because they're writing to two different groups of people. So if you want the full picture, what do? You take one, you lay the other one on top, and you read them together. You have to do that. when you're looking at parables, I've heard people say, well, they're contradicting. No, it doesn't contradict. Put them all together, you get the whole story. Remember I gave the example of me sitting here, and you have two people in those corners and two there, and they see something totally different than there. Right? Does that mean they're wrong? Does that mean they're wrong, or are they any more right than no? You get the whole conversation. Okay? But one of the important things that Jesus says is this. When you see these things come to pass, do what? Look up. For your redemption draweth nigh. In Luke, Jesus goes on to say, you would love to, and I'm paraphrasing, you would love to see one of the days of the Lord. And I believe he's talking about the rapture. Because he gets more in detail on the rapture in Luke than he does in Matthew. Why? Because Jews won't be raptured unless they're part of the body and bride of Christ. The rapture is not for the Jews. The rapture is for the church. The rapture is for the bride of Christ. And so Luke gets into more detail of the rapture. And you might say, well, why didn't Matthew record it? Because Matthew's trying to convince the readers of a totally different side of Christ. The Jew has to understand that Jesus Christ is the Messiah. If they don't get that, they go to hell. Because if sacrifice began tomorrow, it will not cover their sin anymore. Sacrifice is over. Because the ultimate sacrifice has been made. And so when you look at certain things like the rapture and you say, why isn't it mentioned in Matthew? Because Jews won't be raptured. Jewish Christians will be. But they're no longer just Jewish people. Now they're Christians. Now they're the body of Christ. Now they're the bride of Christ. Totally different thing. So Jesus, when he commands his disciples to look up, is he really talking to his disciples? When he says in Luke, you would love to be here for that, but you won't be. So who's he talking to? Say it louder. Us. Thank you. Church. I think it's exciting that Gabriel mentions our generation when he says in the end times, those that are alive in the end, it will all be opened up, the seals will be broken, and they will understand it. That excites me, that Gabriel would mention our generation 2,500 years ago. Think about that. But isn't it more exciting that Jesus Christ himself is telling us to look up? Why? Because we are the ones that are seeing the signs. Not the disciples, not the generations before us, not the 2,000 years in between when he said it and right now. He was thinking of you. And he said to you, when you see these things, because you're going to be alive. How do we know that? Because he goes right into the fig tree and he says, when Israel returns to their land, that is the last generation before my return. We are it. And when Jesus says look up, he's talking to you. He's not talking to the unsaved. These signs are not for the world. These signs are not to try to get somebody saved. If you start hammering somebody with signs of his coming to try to witness to them, you will lose them, I guarantee it. Yep. These are not for them. The signs that we are about to open up and look at, all of those things that Gabriel said would be unsealed, that are unsealed. And I think you're going to kind of get blown away, as we, especially in this first lesson, that of what is unsealed and what is happening in our world right now. He says to you, look up. Why? Because I'm coming soon. And all those people that you know that won't be going with you, it's time to get serious. It's time to stop acting like that It's time to stop living like them. It's time to stop thinking like them. Because I'm coming soon. Behold, I come quickly. And so we're going to start looking at signs tonight. And there was a time in my life that I never thought this would be a sign of the second coming. We're going to talk about the Gog and Magog War. Last week I gave you some homework, and hopefully some of you did your homework, and you read Ezekiel. It doesn't matter if you did or not now, because we're going to read it. The Gog and Magog War has been a controversial war for a long time. Up until fairly recently, there were two main theories as to what this war was. And the reason that these theories became prevalent, number one, is because they had not been unsealed yet. And nobody really needed to know what it was. You're going to see a lot of stuff as we go through these signs that, well, why wasn't this revealed? Why wasn't this revealed? Why were they sealed up? Because no one was supposed to look up until these signs were revealed. Because Jesus says, when you see these things, look up. So that's just to the last church age. And if you agree with my assessment, I hate saying my. If you agree with the assessment that the 7 letters to the churches are 7 church time periods, then we are indeed in the church of Laodicea. And Jesus understood the church of Laodicea and what it would be. And he knew that this would be a lukewarm church, that this would be a church age where Christians thought they had everything, and they didn't need a thing, and they just were horrible. And he would have to tell them, you need to look up, because you're not looking up. You're looking down. You're looking inward. You're looking at all your riches. You're looking at all your power. You're looking at all your splendor. You know what? I'm going to show you signs, because in the end, I'm going to unseal all this so that you, Laodicea, will see the signs, and you need to look up. You're going to have to change your ways. Amen. And you know, if you look around at the church, not our church, at the church, it's dead. It's dead. And you say, well, how can you say that? We have such wonderful buildings, and we send out so many missionaries. Do we? Have you ever researched how many missionaries we send out now? It's not many. We get more missionaries sent to us than we send out. Other countries and mostly other religions. Oh, but you say you're rich to increase your goods. It's time to wake up, church. It's time to wake up. It's time to look up. It's time to be serious. It's not a game. And so we are seeing things that are happening. So the reason many believe that this war has been so controversial is because it was never unsealed. Because we didn't really need to know. Now we do. You say, why do we now? When we're done with this class, you'll understand why now we do. And I think after tonight, you're going to be inviting some people that you've not invited before. You're going to be trying to get your other Christian friends in here to hear this. Because I'm telling you this, if end times scare people, Christians, if end times, I'm not saying don't make you nervous, don't blow this out of proportion. But if it scares you, and it frightens you to think that Christ may be returning soon, then you're not living right. Then you are a weak, lukewarm Christian. And I'm sorry if that sounds mean, but it's time to look up. You should not be afraid of his return. You should be looking forward to it. Paul wrote the books of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians to comfort Christians, so that they would be comforted knowing that their God was coming to get them. Why does it scare us? Because we're lukewarm. Because we are the church of Laodicea, in a nutshell. That's why we look at the signs. Not because it's fun. It is fun for me. And I think you're going to think it's fun. But that's not the reason. The reason is because the time is running short. I don't care if you're pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib. I really don't care. He's coming soon.
If you die, your time is up.
Right. If you die, you're going to meet him now.
You lost it.
But my point is, let's say, well, okay, let's get into this because this is just too much fun. Okay. Turn to Ezekiel 38. So many people for many, many years thought, and some still do, that the Gog and Magog War is one of the two wars mentioned in the book of Revelation. The two major wars, and of course there's lots of little wars going on, but the two major wars mentioned in the book of Revelation is the Battle of Armageddon and the battle at the end of the Millennial Kingdom. Okay? Those are, I'm sorry I keep getting up and down, but I want to stand up so bad that my hip is just killing me. So I'm going to be popping up and down a lot. Forgive me. But if it's distracting, probably me talking about it is more distracting. But I do worry. Because this is a serious thing. You know, when you're in front of people and you're teaching this, if you don't take it serious and you don't realize, yeah, it's serious stuff. And so yeah, I sometimes do apologize too much. And I know I shouldn't because I'm doing what God wants me to do. But anyway, I used to think it was the Battle of Armageddon. Only because it was the best of the two choices. But when you read Ezekiel chapter 38, there are massive contradictions between it and the Battle of Armageddon. And we'll look at those tonight, okay? A lot of people think that the war at the end of the Millennial Kingdom is the Gog and Magog War because both Gog and Magog are mentioned as being part of that war, okay? And so it's also a very viable theory as to which war this is. Again, there are major contradictions between this description of the war and the description in the book of Revelation of the war at the end of the Millennial Kingdom. And we will go over those as well. Okay? So, let's begin by reading chapter 38, verse 1. And the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him. Now, we're going to just do this. I'm not going to read the whole thing. We're going to do it as we read verse by verse. Okay? It might be a little easier to follow. So, basically, who he is prophesying against is Gog, the land of Magog. Gog was the king of Magog. So Gog is not a land, Gog is a person. And so he's saying, I want you to prophesy against the king of Magog, who, by the way, was also the prince of Meshech and Tubal. Okay? And it's all cleared up in the last phrase. It says, and prophesy against him. Not them, him. So he's talking about one person right here and one landmass. Okay? Verse 3. And say, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. And I will turn thee back. And this is interesting. I will turn thee back and put hooks in thy jaws. And I will bring thee forth, and all thine army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armor, even a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. I love this phrase. And this is one of the differences between this war and the War of Armageddon and the war at the end of the millennium. The War of Armageddon, Antichrist, being led by Satan, is the one that is bringing the armies against Israel. Very clear, and we'll look at that when we go through the tribulation, okay? If you want to, on your own time this week, that's one thing you can look up and just look at, okay? At the end of the battle of, or at the end of the Millennial Kingdom, okay, again, Satan is let loose from the bottomless pit. He travels around the world, and he's influencing all the people that are born during that 1,000-year period, and he pulls them to their side, and again, it is Satan bringing those people against Israel. Right here, God says to this man, I will put hooks in your jaws, and I will pull you towards Israel. God causes this war. God is the catalyst that starts this war. So that's a pretty big difference between this one and those other two. But that's just the first one. Then, I love this, verse 5. This is where it gets really interesting. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them. Who's them? Magog and his armies. Gog and his armies. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet. In other words, they're all going to fight with Magog. Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togarmah of the north quarters and all his bands, and many people with him. And then he stops. We have a set group of nations that will be involved in attacking Israel in this war. The big difference between that and Armageddon and Millennial Kingdom, Armageddon, every nation will rise up against Israel. End of the Millennial Kingdom, every nation. It's very clear. Every nation will rise up. Every nation. Every nation. Okay? Here, we have a list of characters. Right? Verse 7. Be thou prepared, and prepare for thyself, thou and all thy company that are assembled unto thee, and be thou a guard unto them. For many days thou shalt be visited in the latter years. Thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword, and is gathered out of many people, against the mountains of Israel, which have been always waste, but is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. Chills go down when I read this, because you realize that let's just go. Many days thou shalt be visited in the latter years. This is why people have said it's either Armageddon or Millennial Kingdom, because it happens in the latter years. Notice it does not say last days. It says latter years. Latter years tend to imply it's getting close to the end. It's getting close to the end time. It's getting close to this. It's not quite there yet. It is very important in respect of what happens in the last days. Okay? But he says in the latter days, this is what's going to happen. Okay? Well, what else happens in the latter days? It says, thou shalt come into the land, and what he's talking about is they're attacking Israel, remember. You're going to come into the land that is brought back from the sword, and is gathered from many peoples and many nations. What's that sound like? 1948, maybe? Here is a peoples that have been scattered by the sword. Okay? Jesus tells his disciples, not one stone is going to stand upon another. He's talking about Rome ransacking Israel, tearing down all of the buildings. In fact, what Rome did, and a lot of people, if you don't like history, because a lot of people hate history, I love history, I always have. But what Rome didn't like to be told no. Okay? And when Rome said, you're going to pay taxes and you're going to bow down to our rule, you either do it or you suffered the wrath of Rome. So, the Jewish people at one point decided, we're not going to pay any more taxes. And they literally rose up and killed the Roman garrison in Jerusalem and threw them out. Rome didn't like it. So they started, the attack from Rome actually started in AD 67. By the year AD 70, Jerusalem was destroyed. And it's interesting that Jesus said that not one stone shall be standing upon another, because you know what the Romans did? They took every single stone, every single brick, every single building material and took it down and laid it waste and covered up other parts of the city with all this debris. And then they moved the city, I think it was 500 or 600 yards to the east, rebuilt it, changed its name, and declared the Jewish God dead. There was not one stone left on top of another. Exactly what Jesus said would happen. And Ezekiel says, those same people that were scattered, they're going to be brought back. And these are the people you're going to attack. It's exciting. Ezekiel wrote this thousands of years ago, and he's talking about this time because the Jews are back. They did return from the sword. They did return from many nations. And this war is going to be God attacking them at a time of peace. So many, and that was one of the things when I thought this was the Battle of Armageddon that I had a real hard time with. Because the Battle of Armageddon, before that happens, there is no peace for Israel. You say, where do you get that? Well, read it. It says it right here. But is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely. All of them. And you say, oh, come on, Israel isn't dwelling safely. You know what? Compared to the rest of the 2,000 years they just endured, this is relative peace. They are a nation again. They basically have no walls. Of course, Jerusalem does. But the only reason it does is because they dug up all the old walls that were torn down and they rebuilt them. Okay? Otherwise, there would be no wall. The places, the settlements where Jewish people live, there's no walls. They live in relative peace. But yeah, you'll get the occasional rocket fired at you once in a while. But in retrospect of being scattered all over the world, this is relative peace for them. And so what Ezekiel is telling Gog and Magog is you're going to come down against Israel while they all dwell in safety. And he gets into that even more a little bit later. It says, thou shalt ascend and come like a storm. Thou shalt be like a cloud to cover the land, thou and all thy bands, and many people with thee. Thus saith the Lord God, it shall also come to pass, that at the same time shall things come into thy mind, and thou shalt think an evil thought. Thou shalt say, listen, I will go up to the land of unwalled villages. I will go to them that are at rest, and dwell safely. All of them dwelling without walls, and having neither bars nor gates. Does that sound like the tribulation? Not to me. Now, it could be the end of the Millennial Kingdom, because there'll be a peace then, because Christ will be reigning. But there's some other things that don't make sense with the end of the Millennial Kingdom either. Verse 12, and this is key. Why are they coming? To take a spoil and to take a prey. They're coming for two reasons. To take spoils and to take prey. And I love this because to take a spoil and to take a prey, to turn thine hand upon the desolate places that are now inhabited, and upon the people that are gathered out of the nations, which have gotten cattle and goods that dwell in the midst of the land. In other words, what he's saying is, Israel was a desolate place before the people came back. And as we look at the signs of the second coming, we are going to get to a section called Signs Concerning Israel. And this one probably should be in that section, but because of everything that's happening right now, I had to move it up. I just had to. Because it's just, there's too much happening, and I just can't hold it in anymore, if you want the honest truth. But what he's saying is, because the people came back, they've made it a beautiful, lush place. And that's going to be real important later. So just keep that in your head as we go on through this, okay? But he says you're coming for a spoil and a prey. What spoils does Israel have? It's desert.
Oil and
Shh. Shh. They really haven't had anything until recently. Oh, are you excited now to hear what's going on? But then, look at the next verse, 13. Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish with all the young lions therefore shall say unto thee, Art thou come to take a spoil? Hast thou gathered thy company to take a prey, to carry away silver and gold, and to take away cattle and goods, to take a great spoil? See, the main function of this is to take spoils and to take prey. The only thing they want to do at the end of the Battle of Armageddon is kill all the Jews. And the only thing they want to do at the end of the Battle of the Millennial Kingdom is to kill Christ and all his followers. They're not here for a spoil in either one of those wars. And so I had a real problem with that part. And I also had a part with the peace thing, that they were living in peace. Well, they're not in peace in the Battle of Armageddon. But they also have countries that will not necessarily come to their defense, but will stick up for them. They will ask these invading countries, are you really going to do this for a spoil and just to kill? Because that's what prey is. You just kill prey. So what two groups of people today would be interested in Israel's spoils and prey? Let's take a look. As we speak, Israel is building a pipeline for the world's largest natural gas reserve ever discovered in 2010. They found this. They have been digging it, or not digging, some of it's digging, but they've been building a pipeline ever since then. As we speak, a lot of Europe is buying those reserves, which is cutting into the profit of a country called Russia, who sells 1/3 of all of its oil reserves to Europe. Israel's building a pipeline to Europe. That pipeline is estimated to be done in the year 2028 or 29. Remember those years. That's when it's supposed to be done. As we sit here, Russia has massive military buildup in Syria, directly north of Israel. Where does this king come from? The north. Where do they come from during the Battle of Armageddon? The east. That's another problem with the Battle of Armageddon. Yeah. Because that army has 2 million men. Which, by the way, the Chinese military will reach 2 million soldiers by the end of this decade.
200
200 million. What did I say?
200.
Oh, yeah. We have that. They will have an army of 200 million by the end of this decade, or 2029. You're going to hear that year come up quite a bit during this whole search or research. That's the spoil part. What about prey? What Arab nation doesn't want Israel gone? What Arab nation even recognizes Israel's right to exist? None until 2 years ago.
The Abraham Accord.
Thank you. President Trump signed the Abraham Accord with Arab nations. Sheba and Dedan, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates. Both of which are in the Abraham Accord. Both of which, when something else that I'm going to talk about in a second happened, came to the defense of Israel. Never before in history has Arab nations stuck up for the Jews until now. Because this year, during Passover, there was also a very large Islamic Muslim holiday. I don't remember what it was. But in years past, when Israel shared policing of Temple Mount with the Muslims, they always had the rule that no more than 10,000 people were allowed on the Temple Mount area at any one time. Because imagine 10,000 people, half Jew, half Muslim. That's just a powder keg. And so they all realized that we need to keep the numbers as low as possible, and they figured 10,000 was a good number. So this year, now that Israel or Jerusalem belongs completely to the Jews, and they are the only ones policing that area now, did you know that was the case? Yeah, that's the case now. So they limited it to 10,000 people again. At the same time, they were going into some of the Golan Heights, and they were throwing out some Palestinians that they suspected were terrorists. Whether they were right or wrong, you pick a side. I'm not picking sides. I'm just telling you what was going on. Well, Hamas got a little upset about both of those things. First off, you're throwing people out of their homes. Secondly, they use the limit of the number as an excuse. You won't let us worship during our holy holiday. And so, you heard this part, they started firing missiles. Okay? Iran told them the reason that you can't hit anything is because you're only firing one missile at a time. You need to fire 100 at a time, or 200 at a time. And Hamas said, well, we don't have that many. And Iran said, don't worry, we do. And they started supplying them. And you say, well, did they really admit that? Yeah, May 15th, 2021, Iran admitted to advising and aiding Hamas. Publicly. Look it up. You can find everything I'm telling you on your own. Okay? Problem is you're not seeing this in the press, are you? No. And so, Iran then, oh, and by the way, just FYI, where it says Persia, that's modern-day Iran. The two major players involved in this Gog and Magog War are Russia and Iran. The two major players. Iran, by the way, has moved large military force into Syria. They have also moved the world's largest attack drone field into Syria and have been launching attack drones into Israel and against the United States. Did you know that we were attacked by a drone? Was it this month? Last month, was it? August. United States, Israel, and the United Kingdom were threatened after a drone attack on an Israeli-operated ship. I'm sorry, that was August. This last one was October. It was this month. And we had military, I think it was 21 military people killed. Did you see any of that? Why? I got the articles right here. I printed them. Why don't you see it? Because the devil's at work. And he knows that Jesus said, look up when you see. And the last thing the devil wants is a church that no longer is sleeping. And so, if you don't think that for the last 10,000 years, the devil, or however long we've been here, if you don't think the devil has been working and setting up his kingdom, he's got all his people in place. He's got all his pieces in place. And God's trying to move his. But are we listening? Are we seeing? Are we looking up? Are we awake? Because he has great things for us. And God's allowing it. Because it's part of his plan. Okay? So, there's more. Sheba and Dedan. And the merchants of Tarshish. Guess where the merchants of Tarshish were located when Ezekiel was written? England. England. And all the young lions. English colonies. And guess who came to Israel Israel's aid or in defense of them after they started firing these missiles, after Russia moves forces into Syria, after Iran moves into Syria, which is north of Israel, which is where these forces will come from. England, United States, Canada, Australia. Merchants of Tarshish and all the young ones. We are watching the beginning of this war happen in front of our eyes. Now, does that scare you or does that excite you? That's exciting to me. We are watching these things happen. Now, this could boil over. Now, you say, well, yeah, but if you're following this, then there was a ceasefire in May. Yeah, you're right. And August is when this ship was hit. October is when our forces were hit. Do I need to go on? Ceasefire means nothing. When the ceasefire was signed, and yeah, they signed it. When the ceasefire was signed, Hamas had fired 3,000 missiles. We're over 5,000 today. Yeah, that ceasefire was real solid. And by the way, Israel's firing back. They're not completely innocent in any of this either. Okay? I'm not being pro-Israel here. I'm just telling you what's going on. And I'm telling you that Ezekiel prophesied this thousands of years ago. And he named the nations that were involved. If this doesn't excite you, I don't know what will. If this is not a sign of the end time, when Ezekiel's saying this is going to happen in the end, okay? So, I'm trying to get through this fairly quick because this is something that I could spend 3 weeks on, but I don't want to do that. So, Sheba and Dedan is actually the Arabian Peninsula, which includes those Arab nations. Merchants of Tarshish is England. Her young lions are the colonies of England. These nations will stand up against the northern armies in defense of Israel. Now you say, what about these other ones? Well, another player that is mentioned, I have all this stuff in there, it's in my way now. Gomer, it mentions Gomer. Gomer is Turkey on May 10th, 2021. This is this year, by the way. You understand how recent all this is. On May 10th, 2021, the Turkish president promised to mobilize all the Arab nations to obliterate Israel. Said that in public. Look it up. May 15th is when Iran admitted to advising Hamas. May 15th also, Iran amasses attack drones on the Israeli northern border. The United Arab Emirates and the other Arab or Mohammed Accord nations are siding with Israel. This is happening right now. You can come up, you can look at this. I want to read you some things. Oh, and then you say, well, okay, so the spoil is the oil or the gas, obviously. But the prey, well, we all know that all Arab nations want all Jews dead. We know that. That's the prey. But you say, well, okay, so Iran's moving drones, and yeah, that's really cool. Okay, well, have you been reading or seeing? Probably not, because the news isn't reporting this. But Israel released statements, and these are, again, October. That the Iranian government is several weeks away from a nuclear bomb. Not years, not months, weeks. They are weeks away from a nuclear bomb. We will not let that happen. And this is a paraphrase quote. How'd you like that? A paraphrase quote. But they made this statement. If the rest of the world will do nothing, we will do what it takes. And let me find it because I want to make sure I'm reading this properly. The Israeli Air Force, and this was reported in October 25th. Pretty recent. It's like last week. The Israeli Air Force starts training for strike on Iranian nuclear program in coming months, weeks, or days. Iran responds to reports of Israel's $1.5 billion strike fund. Israel has set aside $1.5 billion to destroy the Iranian nuclear sites. And then it was October 26th that the U.S. soldiers were killed with the drone attack. When you see these things, this is just the beginning. I quoted Doom. If you haven't seen that movie, you have no idea what I'm talking about.
And this to the thing too. When we left Afghanistan.
Yeah, $85 billion.
Well, that and they got the codes to the attack drones and everything like that, to what they had. They could have gave them over to Iran during that time. It was right before all that.
Yeah, they have the Arab nations, because you know that the Taliban is in league with all of them.
That's correct.
They now have access to more attack helicopters than any other nation in the world next to the United States. We gave it to them.
Yeah. We've done this a lot.
We just walked out. The amount, $85 billion worth of military equipment, we just left.
We even gave them military IDs and ways to make them.
Yeah, all of it, everything we had. The worst part was they got the lists of all of the Arabs that helped us.
Correct.
And they are systematically picking them off. Because they know where they live, they know their families, they know everything. We just gave it to them. We gave it to them.
We sit back here
and we think everything's okay. We are commanded to look up. We are commanded to get serious. The reason that I wanted to talk about Gog and Magog and what's going on right now over there is because I want you to wake up. I want you to take seriously what we're studying. And, the reason I didn't spend more time on pre, mid, and post is because, to be honest with you, I don't care when he comes back. I know he's coming.
Amen.
And I know he's coming for me. And I know I'm going to be part of his bride when he comes to get me. And you need to have that knowledge in your head as well.
And that peace.
But what happens is this. Christians start to fight about, well, you're a pre-trib, and you're a mid-trib, and you're a post-trib, so you're not right with God, and you don't know Scripture, and blah, blah, blah. That is the biggest lie from the devil that will ever come out. If he can keep us fighting with each other, he keeps us from fighting with him.
Yes.
That's why I say, if you want to talk about it, great. I'm ready to move on. Okay? I believe what I believe, but other people disagree, and that's okay. Because none of that will determine my salvation. None of that will determine whether I do or do not go when he does come back. If Jesus wanted us to know beyond a shadow of a doubt, he'd have said, listen, I'm coming before the tribulation starts. Or I'm coming at the end of it. He would have just said it. If it was that important. Because you know what? Salvation's that important. And we're told, whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. There's nothing obligatory about that. There's nothing shady about that. You call upon the name of the Lord, you shall be saved.
It's called faith.
So stop fighting over the dumb stuff. Please don't say, it called the rapture dumb. You know what I'm saying. Okay? Don't fight over how many angels can fit on the head of a needle. Say, where'd that come from? The 70s. Yeah, we used to argue about stuff like that. Jesus says, when you start seeing these signs, hey, Church of Laodicea, I'm talking to you because you're the last church age before I return. Church of Laodicea, those of you that think you're rich, those of you that think you're wealthy and increased with goods and don't need anything, you're going to be the ones to see these signs. It's time to get serious. It's time to look up. It's time to get to work. That's what we need to focus on. I don't want us to come to this study just to go, ooh, that's really cool. This Ezekiel's prophecy is coming true in the Middle East as we sit here. That is cool, yes. That's not the point of this class. The point of this class is to make us listen to what Christ told us and to look up. Look up. Because I'm coming quickly.
Yes.
Who do you know that needs the gospel? Stop wasting time. Family, friend, co-worker, church member. You say, why'd you say church member? Some of the worst things I ever did were with my friends from church.
Amen.
It's true. Some of you are thinking the same thing, if you're honest. It's time to stop being the typical Laodicean. See, we have a lot of benefit living in this time. Because I believe we will see Christ return. I believe it. I could be wrong. I've been wrong a lot in my life.
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. But I believe we will. And we're going to look at these signs, and we're going to look at earthquakes and hurricanes and all these things that have ramped up like mad. And you say, well, yeah, we think it. No, I have proof. I have proof. You know, when I went to search for earthquakes, I thought this will be easy. I'll just go to the United States Geological Survey website and they'll have totals. Try it. It took me 4 weeks the first time that I did this to go through 100 years counting every single earthquake through every single year to get a pattern of what they're doing. You know why? Because the devil doesn't want you to see these things. So he makes it difficult. Why wouldn't they put it totally? You have to count them. It's not an easy thing to do when there's a list this long and the prints, it's not easy. So you're going to see all this. It's not so that you can go home and say, oh, this is cool. It's so that you realize how close it is. Because it's not just one thing anymore. It's not just the Gog and Magog War. It's not just earthquakes. It's on and on and on. Every single sign given in prophetic scripture. It's jumping.
Look up.
Look up. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time. Pray, Lord, that you'd be with us as we go to prayer. Father, we would be looking up. That we would see what's going on around us. That we would, even if we don't see it, if we would just realize, Lord, you're coming soon. And we need to be ready. Help us, Father. Guide us. Teach us. In Jesus' name. Amen. For those of you that were not here, we are going to take a time of prayer.